My name is Eloise. I am 32, working in forensic accounting where everything is measured by cost, exposure, and risk. Independence turned into my trap. During our last argument, Miguel leaned in and whispered, "You are a replaceable calculator, do not forget that." He said this while demanding I co-sign a $100,000 bond. I did not react. If I am replaceable, then the $6,500 in monthly benefits I provide are replaceable too. Before I audit my toxic relatives, tell me your current time and city in the comments. I made my choice. Miguel stared at me, waiting for the usual reaction. He wanted the guilt. He wanted the desperate scramble to please him, the frantic nodding of a daughter who just wanted to buy his approval. Cecilia stood just behind him, nursing a glass of expensive red wine I had paid for, a smug smile playing on her lips. Caleb did not even look up from his smartphone. He simply tapped the screen, completely detached, assuming his latest financial mess would be handled like always. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at the three of them standing in the spacious living room of the Naperville townhouse, a townhouse where my name was on the master lease. Turning around, I walked out the front door into the crisp and unforgiving evening air. I boarded the night train back to my apartment in Chicago. The rhythmic clacking of the train against the tracks matched the steady processing of my own mind. For years, I had treated Miguel, Cecilia, and Caleb like a volatile market that I just needed to endure. But a forensic accountant does not operate on blind hope. We operate on hard data. Opening my laptop, I pulled up my banking dashboard. The glow of the screen illuminated the quiet train car. I stared at the numbers that defined my existence in their eyes. $6,500. That was the baseline monthly bleed. It covered the rent for their suburban townhouse. It covered the lease on the luxury SUV Miguel drove to his golf outings. It covered the premium phone plans, the insurance policies, and the supplementary cards Cecilia swiped without a second thought. Then my eyes shifted to the secondary liability. $80,000. That was the credit limit on the account Caleb treated as his personal venture capital fund. He called himself a tech entrepreneur. He spoke in buzzwords and grand visions, but the balance always hovered dangerously close to the maximum. Cecilia always said I was the lucky one making good money in the city, while her precious son just needed a financial runway to succeed. I'd absorbed all of this because I was conditioned to believe it was my duty. I was the reliable one. I was the financial product they withdrew from whenever life became inconvenient. Miguel had made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed my silence in that living room was submission. It was not. It was an assessment. In forensic accounting, when a liability becomes too toxic to manage, you do not negotiate with it. You isolate it. You freeze the accounts, you cut off the funding, and you let the entity collapse under its own unsustainable weight. The emotional blackmail had worked for a decade because it operated in the shadows. But Miguel had dragged it into the cold light of a transaction. He gave me permission to treat them the same way. I closed the laptop. You might be asking why a professional auditor allowed this massive financial bleeding to continue for 9 long years. The answer was, 7 years old, wore her hair in messy pigtails, and had a severe asthmatic condition. Her name was Adeline. She was Caleb's daughter from a failed marriage that he walked away from when things became too difficult. Cecilia knew exactly how to use her own granddaughter as a psychological weapon against me. Whenever I brought up the crushing weight of the monthly bills, Cecilia would clutch her chest and pivot the conversation directly to Adeline. She would tell me that cutting off the credit cards meant cutting off a little girl's lifeline. She would paint vivid, terrifying pictures of Adeline suffering an asthma attack without proper insurance or being pulled out of her decent elementary school because her aunt was too greedy to help. Miguel and Cecilia used a child as a human shield to protect their own parasitic lifestyle. They knew I loved Adeline too much to let her suffer. But forensic accountants excel at finding alternate routing for blocked assets. I had realized months ago that funding Caleb and Cecilia was the absolute least efficient way to protect my niece. The money I poured into their accounts rarely made it to Adeline's actual needs. So, 3 days before that fateful argument with Miguel, I had scheduled a quiet, private lunch with Tess, Adeline's mother. Tess was exhausted. Working double shifts to make up for the child support Caleb consistently failed to pay. Over coffee, I handed Tess a thick legal envelope. Inside was the documentation for an independent medical and educational trust I had established solely for Adeline. I had bypassed Miguel, Cecilia, and Caleb entirely. Setting up direct payments to Adeline's pediatrician ensured she was covered. I handled her pharmacy copays and wired her school tuition directly to the administration office. The funds were locked heavily restricted and completely inaccessible to anyone sharing my last name. Tess had cried at the table, asking how she could ever repay me for the security. I told her the only repayment I needed was her absolute silence. Miguel and Cecilia could not know the hostage had already been rescued. I needed them to believe they still held the ultimate leverage over my conscience. If Cecilia tried to scream that I was starving my niece, I knew the absolute truth. Adeline was entirely safe, completely insulated from the financial earthquake I was about to unleash. Sitting in my apartment that night, looking out at the city skyline, I felt a profound sense of relief. The heaviest chain binding me to that Naperville townhouse had been quietly broken. They thought they were holding a loaded gun to my morality. They did not realize I had already emptied the chamber. The emotional blackmail was now entirely hollow. I was an auditor with a secure perimeter. I exhaled slowly. With Adeline safely out of the blast radius, I turned my attention back to the massive vulnerability on my personal balance sheet. The $80,000 credit limit I had extended to Caleb, sitting at my kitchen island, bathed in the blue light of my monitor. I began a line-by-item reconciliation of his recent transactions. Caleb always claimed he was on the verge of launching a revolutionary software application. He used words like beta testing, server scaling, and venture capital acquisition to justify the constant drain on the card. He demanded trust, insisting that family members should not audit each other's dreams. But I was not acting as a sister anymore. I was acting as a credentialed investigator. Downloading the raw transaction logs for the past 14 months took only a moment. At first glance, the charges looked like legitimate tech expenses. There were recurring payments to server hosting companies, software licensing fees, and independent contractor payouts. Applying forensic sorting algorithms to the data revealed a highly disturbing pattern. The money was not flowing into legitimate domestic tech firms. Instead, large sums were being systematically broken down into highly specific increments, $9,900, over and over again. Anyone working in financial compliance knows exactly what that number means. It is deliberately structured to fall just below the $10,000 threshold that triggers automatic federal reporting requirements. Caleb was structuring the transactions to avoid institutional scrutiny. Tracing the merchant identification codes attached to these structured payments exposed the truth. They were not pointing to tech developers in Silicon Valley. They were routed through a maze of shell companies before landing in offshore servers located in jurisdictions known for zero regulatory oversight. This was not a tech startup. This was a sophisticated laundering funnel. Caleb was not building an application. He was pouring $80,000 of my hard-earned credit into a shadow network. The realization washed over me cold and sharp. Subsidizing my brother's lazy delusions was one thing. I had been blindly financing something deeply illicit, putting my own professional license and financial security at massive risk. If my firm's compliance department ever ran a random audit on my personal accounts and found these offshore structuring patterns, my career would be instantly terminated. I checked the calendar on my phone. It was Tuesday. I had exactly 72 hours until the annual shareholder dinner at my firm, a prestigious event where my promotion to senior partner was supposed to be quietly finalized. Miguel and Cecilia knew about this dinner. They knew exactly how important it was to my future. The ticking clock echoed in my silent kitchen. I had to dismantle this entire financial architecture before the impending fallout dragged me down with them. The truth was ugly. Staring at the offshore transaction logs brought a brief, terrifying wave of panic. But the anxiety receded as quickly as it arrived, replaced by the memory of a woman named Lydia. Lydia had been a senior partner at my firm, a brilliant, razor-sharp woman who mentored me when I was just a junior analyst. She passed away a year ago, but her voice still echoed clearly in my mind. 2 years prior to this nightmare, I had broken down in Lydia's office. I had missed a crucial client deadline because Cecilia had faked a severe medical emergency, forcing me to wire $10,000 to cover Caleb's supposed business taxes. I was weeping, exhausted, completely drained by the parasitic demands of my blood relatives. Lydia did not offer me a tissue. She did not offer me sentimental sympathy. Instead, she locked her office door, sat across from me, and delivered a masterclass in survival. She told me that biological connection does not obligate you to financial suicide. Lydia had seen my trajectory. She knew my income was going to scale rapidly, and she knew Miguel and Cecilia would escalate their extraction to match every single promotion I earned. That afternoon, Lydia introduced me to a specialized wealth management attorney. She forced me to take the hardest, most necessary step of my adult life. Under her strict guidance, I established an irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a concrete legal structure. Once you place assets inside it, they no longer belong to you as an individual. They belong to the trust itself, managed by an independent trustee. You cannot easily dissolve it, and more importantly, no creditor, no lawsuit, and no manipulative relative can touch it. Over the past 2 years, I had quietly funneled every major bonus, every stock dividend, and the vast majority of my liquid wealth directly into that fortress. The bank accounts Miguel, Cecilia, and Caleb were currently draining represented only my operational cash flow, a superficial layer of my actual net worth. Lydia had taught me to build a vault they could not even see. Sitting in my kitchen, staring at Caleb's illicit offshore transfers, I silently thanked my late mentor. If I had kept my wealth in standard personal accounts, Caleb's shadowy debts or Miguel's reckless liabilities could have eventually targeted my life savings. But because of Lydia's foresight, my core financial existence was untouchable. The trust was a ghost entity legally disconnected from the name Eloise. Miguel and Cecilia thought they had access to my entire kingdom. They had no idea they were only playing in the courtyard. I possessed the ultimate defensive weapon built long before the war even started. The fortress was secure. It is easy for an outsider to look at a 32-year-old financial auditor and wonder why she allowed herself to be exploited for over a decade. The logic seems entirely broken. But psychological conditioning does not care about logic. It cares about repetition. In psychology, there is a concept called learned helplessness. When an animal is subjected to repeated unavoidable stress, it eventually stops trying to escape even when a clear exit is presented. It simply accepts the pain as a permanent state of reality. My conditioning began when I was 18 years old. In our household, the rules of existence were clearly defined by favoritism. Caleb was the golden child. He was the son who carried the legacy, the visionary who was always just one lucky break away from becoming a millionaire. His continuous failures were never his fault. They were always blamed on a bad economy, unfair partners, or simple bad luck. I, on the other hand, was the insurance policy. Miguel and Cecilia never celebrated my academic achievements or my grueling hours studying for my licensing exams. My success was expected not because they were proud of me, but because my stability was the safety net required to fund Caleb's illusions. Whenever I tried to establish a boundary, the emotional retaliation was swift and severe. If I refused to pay a bill, Cecilia would stop eating, claiming my cruelty was making her physically ill. Miguel would gather the extended family at Thanksgiving dinners and give loud speeches about the sacred duty of siblings, staring directly at me while talking about greed and selfishness. I was programmed to believe that my worth was directly proportional to my utility. If I was not providing, I was defective. The invisible chain around my neck was forged from guilt, obligation, and the desperate, pathetic hope that if I just paid enough, they would eventually love me for who I was, not what I financed. I spent my 20s climbing the corporate ladder, earning a massive salary, yet feeling completely powerless inside my own family. Negotiating complex mergers for multinational corporations was my daily reality, but I could not say no to Miguel demanding a car lease. The paradox was humiliating. I was a giant in the boardroom and a hostage in the living room. But learned helplessness requires the victim to believe the illusion of powerlessness is real. Miguel breaking that illusion by calling me a replaceable calculator had snapped the chain. He had accidentally set me free. The programming was dead. Cecilia had perfected the economics of guilt over 3 decades. She had not held a formal job in her entire adult life, yet she treated her anxiety and her occasional heart palpitations as a highly effective, infinitely renewable currency. Whenever I presented a logical budget or simply asked why Caleb needed another $5,000 for a vague project, Cecilia would instinctively clutch her chest. She would dramatically gasp for air, collapse onto the nearest expensive sofa, and declare that my cold, calculating cruelty was actively killing her. She weaponized biology. She made it mathematically impossible to refuse a financial request without immediately becoming a murderer in the eyes of the family. Miguel played a completely different role in this toxic marketplace. He was the strict enforcer of patriarchal authority. He had spent his entire career as a mid-level manager, a man who loved the sound of his own voice but never achieved the executive power he felt the universe owed him. Because the corporate world largely ignored him, he demanded absolute, unquestioning submission at home. He used heavy words like loyalty, heritage, and respect to describe what was, in reality, pure financial extortion. To Miguel, my corporate success was not a testament to my intelligence or my grueling 80-hour work weeks. It was simply an asset class that belonged to the family portfolio. He believed that because he provided me with a roof and basic sustenance during my childhood, he was entitled to a permanent, unyielding dividend on my lifetime earnings. I was not a daughter with her own dreams or boundaries. I was a high-yield bond. And Caleb was the sacred male heir, the golden boy who could do absolutely no wrong. His continuous professional failures were just stepping stones. My consistent successes were just funding mechanisms for his lifestyle. If I ever tried to point out the glaring asymmetry of our roles, Miguel would slam his fist on the dining table. He would yell that a real family does not keep score and that my obsession with numbers was a moral defect. But the truth was, they were keeping score. Every single day. They just did not want me to see the ledger. I spent my 20s trying to buy their genuine affection. I thought if I just paid off one more maxed-out credit card, if I just funded one more of Caleb's phantom tech ventures, they would finally look at me with pride rather than expectation. But you cannot buy love from people who only value the transaction. Their vocabulary of love was nothing but a sophisticated disguise for dependency. Tonight, sitting alone in my kitchen and looking at the undeniable evidence of Caleb's offshore gambling transfers, the heavy fog of my past completely lifted. The years of psychological conditioning dissolved. I finally understood that they did not want a daughter. They wanted a permanent subsidy with no expiration date, no negotiation, and absolutely no acknowledgement of the labor required to maintain it. The market of guilt they had constructed was fundamentally fraudulent. And as a forensic auditor, I do not tolerate fraudulent markets. The trading floor was officially closed. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The sprawling city of Chicago was quiet, the distant, muffled hum of traffic barely reaching my high-rise window. Pouring a glass of cold water, I sat back down at my kitchen island and opened the primary management portal for my banking institution. It was time to execute the first phase of the separation. I did not feel angry. I did not feel vindictive. I felt incredibly rational, like a surgeon preparing for a highly precise, necessary amputation. Starting with the most dangerous liability on my balance sheet, I targeted the $80,000 credit limit. Caleb held the primary supplementary card, but Miguel and Cecilia also had cards physically printed with their names all tied directly to my personal credit score. I navigated to the authorized user management page. The digital interface was sterile, clean, and beautifully simple. A vertical list of names, a row of digital toggle switches. Selecting Cecilia's name first felt surprisingly routine. The banking system prompted a standard warning window, asking if I was absolutely certain I wanted to revoke access. Confirming the choice took less than a second. The green toggle turned flat gray. Her card was dead. Moving down to Miguel required the same effortless motion. Another confirmation prompt. His card was dead. Finally, my cursor hovered over Caleb's name. The conduit for his offshore gambling network. The massive financial drain that had nearly jeopardized my entire professional licensing, clicking revoke, felt like severing a infected limb. The $80,000 limit was instantly locked away behind an impenetrable digital wall. The banking application did not send them any text, alerts, or email notifications. The system only communicates securely with the primary account holder. When they woke up the next morning, they would have absolutely no idea that their financial reality had been fundamentally altered. They would assume the ATM was still dispensing cash, completely unaware that the machine had been unplugged from the wall. It astonished me how quickly 9 years of deep, parasitic dependency could be undone. Just 3 clicks of a mouse, and the blood supply was permanently severed. Opening the portal for our shared emergency checking account was next. I moved the remaining liquid funds money I had deposited entirely from my own paycheck into a new, heavily encrypted personal account protected by two-factor authentication. I left exactly $0.00 in the joint account. I wanted a clean, undeniable exit, not a sentimental conversation about minimum balances or shared resources. Treating my own parents and brother like a hostile corporate takeover felt incredibly strange. Yet that was exactly what this situation required. The moment Miguel told me I was a replaceable calculator, he unknowingly gave me the final authorization to recalculate the entire structure of our relationship. I was not plotting revenge. I was simply enforcing standard financial practice for independent adults. Adults manage their own liabilities. Closing the banking portal, I shut the laptop lid. The screen went dark, reflecting my own calm, resolute expression. The financial cord was cut. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting a pale, cold light into my living room. Sleeping for exactly 4 hours had been enough. My mind was remarkably sharp and clear. Phase 1 of the audit was complete. Phase 2 required strict external administration. Opening my work laptop, I deliberately bypassed my personal emails and pulled up the digitized leasing documents for the townhouse in Naperville. Signing the master lease for that expensive property 5 years ago had been a mistake bred from manipulation. Miguel had claimed his credit score was temporarily damaged due to a mysterious clerical error, and Cecilia had wept uncontrollably about the horrifying prospect of living in a cramped, ordinary apartment. Consequently, I attached my pristine credit rating to a spacious 4-bedroom townhouse in a premium suburban neighborhood. They enjoyed the manicured lawns, the attached garage, and the prestige of the zip code, all while I silently transferred the heavy rent payment on the first of every single month. Locating the direct contact information for the property management company took moments. The lease was scheduled to expire at the end of the next month. Usually, I would simply authorize an automatic 12-month renewal without a second thought. Not today. Drafting a formal, legally binding email to the leasing office felt incredibly empowering. I stated clearly that I, the master, guarantor, and primary leaseholder, would not be renewing the contract under any circumstances. I formally relinquished all financial and legal responsibility for the property effective on the final date of the current term. Adding a very specific instruction to the email was vital. I requested that the management company send the standard physical notice of non-renewal, the intent to vacate or sign new lease document directly to the property address via certified mail. Breaking the news to Miguel and Cecilia over a screaming phone call was not on my agenda. I wanted the cold reality of their situation to arrive in an official, legally stamped envelope. The leasing office required a secure digital signature to process the termination. I provided it immediately. It is a fascinating psychological shift when you simply stop absorbing other people's consequences. For years, I genuinely believed I was obligated to subsidize a luxury lifestyle that they blatantly refused to afford themselves. Miguel called it family loyalty. Cecilia called it unconditional love. Caleb called it sibling teamwork. I finally understood that their entire vocabulary was nothing but a sophisticated disguise for endless extraction. Removing my name from the lease was not rendering them homeless. It was simply returning the mathematical reality of housing back to them. The United States rental market evaluates risk strictly through income verification and credit history. My signature had magically converted their massive financial risk into my personal debt. I was completely done shielding them from the open market. They had 30 days to figure out how to satisfy a landlord's basic, mandatory requirements. I hit send. The momentum of liberation is highly addictive. Once you start systematically dismantling a parasitic structure, every subsequent administrative action feels lighter, easier, and infinitely more logical. By mid-morning, taking a personal day from the auditing firm seemed like the best investment I could make to finish the administrative purge without any corporate distractions. Picking up my phone, I bypassed my contacts list and dialed my auto insurance provider. The family insurance policy was a sprawling, expensive mess. It covered my reliable compact sedan, but it also fully insured Miguel's heavy-duty SUV and Caleb's imported luxury car. Caleb had failed a standard background credit inquiry 3 years ago, meaning his standalone premium would have been absolutely astronomical. Naturally, I was expected to absorb them into my policy to secure a multi-car discount, a minor discount that barely offset the massive overall financial burden I was carrying. The customer service representative answered politely. Requesting a complete and immediate separation of assets caught her slightly off guard. I instructed her to remove Miguel and Caleb's vehicles from my policy effective today. She paused the sound of tapping on her keyboard, filling the silence, and gently warned me that my personal premium would adjust slightly upward once the multi-car bundle was officially broken. Accepting the adjustment required no hesitation. The financial argument for keeping them on my policy had entirely evaporated the moment I uncovered Caleb's offshore gambling transfers. "Are you absolutely sure you want to drop these vehicles, ma'am? They will be driving uninsured as of midnight tonight unless they secure new independent policies," the representative advised, her tone laced with professional concern. "I am absolutely sure," I replied smoothly. "Please email me the PDF confirmation documents immediately." Within 10 minutes, the documents arrived in my inbox. If Miguel or Caleb drove those cars tomorrow, they would assume 100% of the legal and financial liability. Next was the family cellular plan. This was perhaps the most deeply entrenched tether of all. I paid for unlimited data premium device upgrades and international roaming for all three of them. Calling the telecommunications carrier involved an identical protocol. I requested a hard, uncompromising severing of the lines. The agent explained that separating the accounts meant Miguel, Cecilia, and Caleb would each have to establish individual contracts subject to individual credit checks and current undiscounted market rates. Approving the massive change, I paid the final prorated balance for the current billing cycle out of my own pocket and authorized the disconnect. From tomorrow onward, any data usage, any shattered screen replacement, and any phone call they made would be billed directly to them. None of these actions were vengeful. None of them were dramatic. They were simply standard, boring administrative corrections for adults living in America. I was merely stepping aside and letting gravity do its job. The cleanup was complete. Late in the afternoon, the administrative purge was definitively finished. Every single financial bridge connecting me to the townhouse in Naperville had been systematically detonated. Sitting in my home office, I gazed out the large glass window at the towering skyscrapers of the Loop. The sky was turning a bruised, vibrant purple, and the city lights were just beginning to flicker on, illuminating the grid below. For the first time in 9 years, I felt a profound, untouchable silence in my own life. My phone lay face down on the polished wooden desk. It had not rung yet. Miguel, Cecilia, and Caleb were still operating under the comfortable illusion of unlimited, unconditional access. They were likely going about their day completely oblivious to the fact that their plastic cards were now useless pieces of garbage. Their cars were massive uninsured liabilities, and their prestigious address was quietly counting down its final 30 days. Opening a secure browser window one last time before logging off for the evening felt necessary. I securely logged into the independent medical and educational trust I had established for Adeline. Verifying the upcoming tuition transfer and confirming the pharmacy escrow account was fully funded brought a wave of peace. Tess had quietly accepted the arrangement, keeping Adeline entirely insulated from the impending explosion. The only innocent variable in this entire toxic equation was safe. That was all that mattered to my conscience. Pouring myself a glass of cold water, I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. In forensic accounting, there is a concept known as the quiet period. It is the brief, highly tense window of time between when an auditor successfully locks down a compromised financial system and when the perpetrators actually realize they have been cut off from the funds. It is a moment of absolute stillness right before the inevitable chaos erupts. I knew exactly what was coming. They would deploy their usual exhausted emotional strategies. They would rotate through moral language, manufactured guilt, family tradition, and intense psychological fear. Cecilia would invoke terrifying medical anxiety. Miguel would invoke occupational shame threatening my career. Caleb would invoke the sacred bond of sibling unity. They would aggressively use the word family to imply a binding legal obligation. They would describe my reasonable boundary as an unforgivable, cruel abandonment. But the market is entirely indifferent to feelings. A bank terminal does not accept biological connection or tears as a valid form of collateral. I watched the digital clock on my monitor tick forward. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Someone was going to need to pump gasoline. Someone was going to try to buy premium groceries. Someone was going to try to fund an offshore gambling server. When would the first card decline? The heavy silence finally broke at exactly 1:15 in the afternoon the following day. Sitting in a soundproof, glass-walled conference room, I was meticulously reviewing a complex risk projection matrix for a major corporate client when my personal phone vibrated aggressively against the mahogany table. The screen lit up with a text message from Caleb. Ignoring the immediate urge to check it, I let it sit there for 3 full minutes, finishing my precise notes on the projection model before I finally flipped the phone over. The message was frantic, demanding, and completely lacking any basic greeting. Card is glitching. Gas station pump keeps rejecting it. Call the bank and clear the fraud alert right now. I have a meeting across town and I'm running on empty. He spoke to me not as a sister, but as a defective, slow-moving customer service representative. He naturally assumed the rejection was a technical error because the concept of me actively denying him access was literally unimaginable to his highly privileged mind. He genuinely believed that high fuel prices automatically justified his assumption that I should absorb his daily transportation costs. Unlocking the phone, I tapped my response. My fingers moved steadily across the glass. Exclamation points to convey emotion were unnecessary. Offering a soft, apologetic preamble to cushion the blow would defeat the purpose. I simply typed, "The card is not experiencing a glitch. The account has been permanently deactivated. You will need to use your own funds to purchase fuel." Hitting send, I watched the little delivered icon securely appear. The typing bubbles materialized almost instantly on the screen. They danced rapidly for 10 seconds, disappeared completely, and then reappeared with furious speed. "Stop playing games, Eloise. This isn't funny. Turn it back on right now. I don't have time for your dramatic episodes today." He was trying to minimize my firm boundary by labeling it as a dramatic emotional episode. Typing my final definitive reply for the afternoon felt like sealing a vault. There is no game. Financial access is not a birthright. Your card is dead. The typing bubbles vanished entirely. Caleb did not respond. The harsh realization was likely washing over him, hitting him right there at the gas pump in front of a line of impatient drivers. The ATM had suddenly swallowed his card and the screen read 0. The first domino had officially fallen. The parasitic ecosystem was experiencing its first true terrifying drought. Locking my phone, I slid it quietly into my blazer pocket and turned my undivided attention back to the corporate risk matrix. The audit had begun. Exactly 1 hour after Caleb's desperate text message, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Cecilia's name. Letting it ring 3 times while taking a slow sip of my coffee allowed me to brace for the inevitable. I did not say hello upon answering. I simply waited for the performance to begin. Through the speaker, the distinct, chaotic background noise of a busy, upscale grocery store was impossible to miss. There was the rhythmic beeping of a barcode scanner, the low murmur of other shoppers, and the unmistakable sound of Cecilia hyperventilating. She did not ask if I was busy at work. Launching directly into a theatrical display of maternal panic, her voice was shaking perfectly pitched to draw sympathy from the cashier and anyone standing in the checkout lane. "Eloise, what is happening with the bank? The terminal is completely rejecting the card. I am standing here completely humiliated in front of half the neighborhood. Are you trying to starve your own family? Are you trying to kill your niece?" There it was, the ultimate psychological weapon. Deploying Adeline's name was her strategy to instantly crush any logical argument I might present. Cecilia knew exactly how to manufacture a crisis. "Adeline has her severe asthma flare-ups this time of year, Eloise. She needs specialized organic food. She needs her daily medications. If you lock this card, you are putting a 7-year-old child in the hospital. Fix this error right now." In the past, the mere mention of Adeline in danger would have caused me to instantly open my laptop and wire thousands of dollars without a single question. I would have felt a suffocating wave of guilt. But today, possessing verified data destroyed her emotional manipulation. Leaning back in my office chair, my voice remained completely devoid of any thermal temperature. I transferred the required medical funds directly into a secure escrow account managed by Tess 3 weeks ago, I stated clearly. Adeline has full premium health coverage, and her pharmacy tab is entirely prepaid for the next 12 months. You do not buy her medicine, Cecilia. You never have. The line went completely dead silent. The hyperventilating instantly stopped. I could picture her standing frozen by the payment terminal. Furthermore, I continued my tone, dropping to a clinical whisper. I know exactly what is sitting in your shopping cart right now. It is imported red wine, premium cuts of beef, and artisan cheeses. You are not trying to feed a sick child. You are trying to fund your own luxury weekend. The bank did not make a mistake. You have exactly zero access to my credit. You will need to hand your own debit card to the cashier, or you will need to put the groceries back on the shelf. Cecilia tried to sputter a response, but the manufactured panic was gone, replaced by genuine, bewildered shock. I did not wait for her to find her words. I ended the call. The humiliating rejection at the grocery store fundamentally shifted the dynamic. They realized I was not playing a temporary game. By late afternoon, the victim routine was entirely abandoned, replaced by aggressive, cornered hostility. The sun was beginning to set over the Chicago skyline when Miguel called. Bypassing pleasantries or fake confusion, his deep voice boomed through the speaker the moment I answered, vibrating with barely contained rage. You listen to me very carefully, Miguel growled, completely abandoning the fatherly persona he usually wore in public. I do not know what kind of arrogant, disrespectful phase you are going through, but it ends right now. You are going to call your bank, and you are going to restore the credit limits. Then you are going to sign the $100,000 surety bond for your brother's new project. You owe this family your success. He spoke as if dictating terms to a disobedient subordinate, believing that sheer volume and patriarchal authority could simply bulldoze over my financial boundaries was his fundamental error. I remained completely silent, letting his anger echo in the empty space of my office. My silence only infuriated him further. He decided to deploy his ultimate leverage. I know exactly what tomorrow night is, Miguel sneered, his voice dropping into a sinister cadence. I know your fancy corporate firm is hosting their annual shareholder dinner at the downtown hotel. I know they are supposed to announce your big promotion to senior partner. You think you are so untouchable in your glass tower. Pausing, he let the threat hang heavy in the air. If you do not authorize that bond and restore those cards by noon tomorrow, your mother and I will walk directly into that ballroom. We will stand in front of your wealthy clients and your powerful executives, and we will tell them exactly what kind of heartless, greedy daughter they are about to promote. We will tell them you abandon your own flesh and blood. Let us see how your pristine professional reputation survives a public family scandal. It was a brilliant, terrifying, tactical maneuver. In the high-stakes world of corporate finance, reputation and ethical standing are paramount. A loud, screaming domestic dispute in the middle of a black-tie shareholder event could easily cause the board of directors to reconsider giving me a massive portfolio of institutional clients. Miguel was holding my entire decade of grueling career advancement hostage. He expected me to crumble, to weep, to beg him to stay away. Instead, I felt an intense, burning clarity. He was no longer acting as a disappointed father. He was acting as a hostile financial terrorist, attempting to extort $100,000 through public defamation. In my profession, when an entity attempts extortion, you do not negotiate a settlement. You immediately initiate a deep-dive forensic audit to uncover their weakest point. The battle line was drawn. Miguel's brutal threat did not paralyze me. It mobilized me. If he was willing to burn my career to the ground over Caleb's supposed technology project, knowing exactly what that project truly was became imperative. Staying in my office long after the cleaning staff had vacuumed the corridors, I locked the heavy glass door. Pulling up the raw data files from Caleb's deactivated $80,000 credit line, I began a surgical, microscopic dissection of the numbers. Earlier, the recurring transactions of $9,900 routed to offshore servers had caught my eye. Now, piercing the corporate veil of those shell companies was necessary. Forensic accounting is not about staring at math. It is about reading a story written in digital ink. People can lie with their mouths, but their money always tells the absolute uncompromising truth. Utilizing specialized tracing software, typically reserved for uncovering corporate embezzlement, I tracked the routing numbers associated with the offshore holding accounts. They bounced through 3 different Caribbean tax havens before finally settling into a master ledger. Cross-referencing the merchant identification numbers with international regulatory databases populated the results on my screen glowing with undeniable criminality. Caleb was not funding a software startup. He was not buying servers or paying independent coding contractors. Every single dollar of that $80,000 limit had been systematically funneled into an illicit, highly unregulated international sports gambling syndicate. The structured payments were specifically designed to hide the massive losses from domestic banking authorities. My brother was a degenerate, high-stakes gambler, and he was using my pristine credit profile as his personal casino chip. The sheer audacity of the theft made my pulse steady. Tracking the timeline of his worst losses revealed a perfect alignment with the exact dates Cecilia would call me weeping hysterically, claiming Caleb needed emergency capital to prevent his business from collapsing. The entire family narrative of the struggling visionary entrepreneur was a fabricated shield to protect a severe gambling addiction. But the most critical question remained unanswered. Did Miguel and Cecilia genuinely believe Caleb's startup lies, making them foolish victims of their own son? Or did they know exactly where my money was going? To effectively neutralize Miguel's threat to ruin my corporate dinner, determining the exact level of their complicity was crucial. I needed irrefutable proof of who was directing the fraud. Minimizing the banking portal, I opened a secondary browser. Years ago, I had set up a shared family email account to handle utility bills and joint insurance policies. The administrative recovery passwords were still valid. It was time to audit the internal communications of my own bloodline. I cracked the digital vault. The shared family email inbox was a chaotic mess of promotional offers, overdue digital notices, and spam. Bypassing all the junk, I initiated a highly targeted keyword search. Typing in Caleb's name combined with words like debt payment and urgent prompted the search engine to spin for 3 seconds before populating a specific thread of messages. These were exchanged between Miguel, Cecilia, and Caleb over the past 6 months. Opening the oldest thread made the blood freeze in my veins. It was not a conversation of worried parents trying to help a struggling son. It was a strategic planning session for systemic extortion. Caleb had written a frantic message detailing a massive loss on an offshore sports wager, stating that specific dangerous people were looking for immediate repayment. Cecilia's response was not shock or disappointment. She wrote, "Do not panic. I will call Eloise tomorrow morning and tell her your primary server crashed and you need emergency hardware funding. I will cry. It always works when I cry." Scrolling to the next message dated just 4 weeks ago revealed Miguel's reply to Caleb regarding a completely maxed-out credit card. "You need to be careful with the bookies. Route the payments exactly how I told you to. Keep it under $10,000 so her bank doesn't flag it. Just keep swiping Eloise's card. She makes too much money to notice, and if she complains, I will remind her how selfish her generation is. We have to keep this quiet." My hands hovered over the keyboard, completely motionless. The depth of the betrayal was almost incomprehensible. They were not ignorant. They were fully legally and morally complicit. Miguel and Cecilia knew their son was swimming in illicit gambling debt to dangerous syndicates. Instead of forcing him into treatment or demanding accountability, they actively conspired to use my professional success as a human shield. They willfully sacrificed my financial security to protect his gambling habit from the violent consequences of the real world. They had reduced my entire existence to a disposable asset. They were willing to march into my corporate dinner and destroy my reputation not because they felt disrespected, but because I had inadvertently cut off the funding to a criminal enterprise that was keeping their son out of physical danger. The profound disgust I felt was entirely cleansing. Any lingering microscopic fragment of daughterly guilt I held was instantly incinerated by the cold, harsh light of their documented conspiracy. Highlighting the entire email thread, I clicked print. The heavy laser printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, spitting out page after page of undeniable, legally binding proof. The trap was fully built. With the printed evidence of their gambling conspiracy stacked neatly on my desk, finalizing the ultimate defensive perimeter was the next logical step. Miguel believed he could intimidate me because he assumed family dynamics operate on emotion, fear, and public shame. But introducing him to the absolute unforgiving nature of a legal process was about to change his perspective entirely. Opening the heavy fireproof safe in the corner of my office, I retrieved a thick, blue legal binder. Inside was the documentation for the irrevocable trust that Lydia, my late mentor, had forced me to establish 2 years ago. To the average person, a trust sounds like a complicated mechanism reserved exclusively for billionaires. In reality, it is a magnificent piece of legal architecture designed to separate an individual from their assets. Signing those papers effectively transferred the legal ownership of my stocks, my investment portfolios, and my primary savings from Eloise the daughter to a completely independent legal entity. This is the brilliant cruelty of financial law. Once an irrevocable trust is sealed, the grantor cannot easily alter it, and more importantly, no external party can pierce it. If Miguel marched into my corporate dinner, caused a catastrophic scene, and successfully convinced my firm to terminate my employment, he would achieve absolutely nothing financially. If he tried to sue me for some fabricated breach of verbal contract to support them, a judge would look at my personal accounts and see virtually nothing. The money was locked behind a wall of titanium paperwork. Miguel could scream about biological duty until his lungs collapsed, but biology has absolutely zero jurisdiction over a legally binding trust document signed in front of independent witnesses and a state notary. The papers do not care about blood. They do not care about guilt. They only care about authorized signatures. Lydia had understood that toxic families use emotional kettrios to create financial leakage. Forcing me to build this trust had provided me with a bulletproof vest. Sitting at my desk, carefully reviewing the summary pages of the trust, confirmed everything was perfectly balanced, perfectly secured, and completely out of their reach. The only money they had ever touched was the operational cash I had voluntarily placed in front of them. Tomorrow night, when Miguel attempted his grand extortion at the black-tie dinner, discovering that he was bringing a knife to a drone strike would be a rude awakening. Arguing with him about love or family values was pointless. Presenting him with the mechanical, unfeeling reality of forensic documentation would suffice. Justice does not always require a screaming match. The most devastating form of justice is a quiet, legally executed process. If you've ever discovered that your sacrifices were just funding someone else's lies, let me know in the comments. The audit was finalized. The morning of the annual shareholder dinner arrived with a heavy, overcast sky. The city of Chicago felt gray and metallic, matching the precise clinical mood inside my apartment. Today was the most important day of my professional career, the culmination of a decade of relentless auditing, late nights, and flawless client management. It was also the day I would permanently amputate my biological family. Feeling no anxiety, I only sensed the steady, methodical rhythm of a professional executing a finalized plan. Standing at my kitchen island, I transformed the marble surface into a staging ground for the evening's confrontation. Relying on digital files stored on a phone was a mistake amateurs made. Physical documents carry a psychological weight that cannot be swiped away or ignored. The printed offshore transaction logs, with the structured payments of $9,900 clearly highlighted, went into a thick manila envelope. This was Exhibit A. Next, I handled the printed pages from the shared family email account. The messages where Cecilia promised to manufacture fake tears, and where Miguel explicitly directed Caleb on how to launder the gambling money through my credit card without triggering federal warnings, were damning. Clipping these pages together, ensuring the timestamps and sender addresses were highly visible, I slid them into a second manila envelope. This was Exhibit B. Finally, the official notification from the Naperville Property Management Company confirming that the master lease on their luxury townhouse would be permanently terminated in exactly 29 days needed inclusion. Adding a single stamped summary page of my irrevocable trust proved that any future legal attempts to drain my wealth would hit a solid concrete wall. These went into a third envelope, Exhibit C. Taking a heavy red marker, I clearly numbered the envelopes. 1, 2, 3. Placing them inside a sleek black leather portfolio grounded me. Walking into an emotional family dispute was not happening. Walking into a boardroom presentation where the opposing party had already committed fatal corporate suicide was the reality. Walking into my bedroom, I pulled the dress from its protective garment bag. It was a tailored, structured black dress, severe and elegant. Pairing it with simple, sharp heels completed the look. Looking at myself in the full-length mirror, the terrified, guilt-ridden daughter who used to wire thousands of dollars just to stop Cecilia from crying was gone. A senior partner of a major forensic accounting firm stared back. Picking up the black leather portfolio containing the destruction of my family's illusions, I walked out the door. The grand ballroom of the downtown Chicago hotel was a masterpiece of corporate elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of perfectly arranged circular tables. The soft hum of a jazz quartet blended seamlessly with the clinking of champagne glasses and the low, confident voices of the city's financial elite. Sitting at a table near the front, wearing my tailored black dress, my leather portfolio rested quietly on the empty chair beside me. Tonight was the night my promotion to senior partner was going to be officially announced by the firm's chief executive officer. It was the exact environment Miguel had threatened to destroy. Checking my watch confirmed it was exactly 8:30 in the evening. The main course had just been cleared, and the CEO was making his way toward the podium. Just as he tapped the microphone, a sudden jarring commotion erupted at the back of the room. The heavy oak doors were pushed open with aggressive force. 3 figures bypassed the frantic event concierge and stepped onto the thick carpet of the ballroom. It was Miguel, Cecilia, and Caleb. Orchestrating their appearance to maximize shock value was deliberate. Formal attire was absent. Cecilia wore an oversized faded cardigan, looking intentionally disheveled and frail. Miguel wore a wrinkled jacket, his face twisted into a mask of righteous paternal suffering. Caleb stood slightly behind them, looking down at the floor, playing the role of the broken, abandoned son. Looking like victims cast out into the freezing cold by a heartless corporate villain was the aesthetic they aimed for. The low murmur of conversation in the ballroom evaporated almost instantly. The jazz quartet stopped playing. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned toward the back of the room, and then inevitably, those eyes tracked across the tables to find me. The silence was absolute and suffocating. This was the exact nightmare scenario that keeps people trapped in abusive families for their entire lives. The profound, paralyzing fear of public humiliation. Miguel locked eyes with me from across the room. Puffing out his chest, he appeared completely energized by the captive audience he had just acquired. Believing he had cornered me, he assumed that the sheer terror of losing my professional prestige would force me to instantly surrender. He expected me to beg him to step outside to write a check for $100,000 right there in the lobby just to make the scandal disappear. We are minutes away from the final collision. Have you ever had your boundaries severely tested in a public environment? If this resonates with you, let me know in the comments below. I did not flinch. Miguel did not wait for security to approach him. Taking 3 steps forward into the center aisle, he projected his deep voice so that it bounced off the acoustic paneling of the ballroom. Ensuring every senior executive, every major client, and every managing partner heard his manufactured tragedy was his goal. "There she is," Miguel boomed, pointing a trembling, dramatic finger in my direction. "The brilliant financial auditor. The woman you are all celebrating tonight. What you don't know is that she abandons her own flesh and blood to enjoy luxury. She leaves her aging parents to face the street. She coldly refuses to save her own brother from absolute financial ruin while she drinks champagne." Cecilia immediately buried her face in her hands, letting out a loud theatrical sob. The performance was meticulously designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. Society conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable covenant. Taught from childhood that family is everything, setting yourself on fire to keep your relatives warm is framed as the ultimate form of noble sacrifice. Publicly cutting off your parents is widely viewed as the ultimate moral failure. Miguel was weaponizing that exact societal stigma against me. But sitting there under the bright lights, shame was absent. A profound sense of philosophical clarity washed over me. Disconnecting from toxic relatives is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary, dignified act of self-preservation. When biological connections are used exclusively as leverage for financial extraction, the concept of family ceases to exist. It simply becomes an unwritten, non-consensual contract of eternal debt. Yielding to his public shaming would only validate his extortion. 2 large security guards in dark suits finally materialized from the lobby, moving quickly to grab Miguel by the shoulders. Standing up from my chair, the fabric of my dress fell perfectly into place. Raising my hand in a calm, authoritative gesture, I signaled the security personnel to halt. They paused, looking at my firm's CEO, who gave them a subtle nod to let me handle it. Picking up the black leather portfolio from the chair beside me, I stepped out from behind my table. Walking slowly, deliberately down the center aisle toward the 3 of them felt powerful. The only sound in the massive room was the steady, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the floor. Looking like a terrified daughter caught in a scandal was not the image I projected. I looked like an auditor approaching a severely compromised ledger. The illusion was over. Stopping exactly 3 feet in front of Miguel, I observed his incredibly triumphant expression. A smug satisfaction gleamed in his eyes. Genuinely thinking I was walking over to surrender, he expected a desperate plea for a private negotiation. Unzipping the black leather portfolio, my movements were fluid and entirely devoid of panic. "You came here to publicly discuss my financial obligations to this family, Miguel," I said. My voice was not loud, but the absolute silence in the ballroom carried my words to the furthest tables. "So let us conduct the audit in public." Pulling out the first envelope marked with a red A, I extracted the thick stack of offshore transaction logs and pressed them firmly into Caleb's chest. He reflexively grabbed the papers. "That is the $80,000 I provided for your tech startup, Caleb. Specifically, the $9,900 structured payments routed to unregulated Caribbean sports betting syndicates. You are not an entrepreneur. You are heavily indebted to a criminal enterprise." Caleb's face drained of all color. His jaw fell open and his eyes darted around the room, realizing that elite financial executives were actively listening to his exposure. Without pausing, I pulled out envelope B. Extracting the printed email thread, I held it directly in front of Miguel's face. Reading his own words aloud, my voice remained clinical and flat. "Keep swiping Eloise's card. She makes too much money to notice, and if she complains, I will remind her how selfish her generation is. That is your email, Miguel. You knew exactly where the money was going. You actively conspired to use my professional credentials to launder your son's gambling debt." Cecilia stopped her theatrical sobbing instantly. Staring at the papers, her mouth opened and closed like a fish completely deprived of oxygen. The narrative she had built for the room, the story of the starving abandoned parents, had just been obliterated by a paper trail of willful, documented extortion. Reaching into the portfolio one last time, I pulled out envelope C and handed it to Cecilia. "Since you enjoy dramatic announcements, you can read that one yourself. It is the formal termination of the master lease on the Naperville townhouse. You have exactly 29 days to vacate the premises or sign a new lease using your own verifiable income." Stepping back, I surveyed the three of them. "You did not come here tonight because you miss your daughter. You came here because your automated teller machine finally installed a firewall after 9 years." I turned my back. The impact of the documents was immediate and devastating. Miguel stood frozen in the center aisle, the printed emails trembling slightly in his rigid hands. Opening his mouth to speak to launch another booming patriarchal defense proved useless as no sound came out. The illusion of his authority had relied entirely on my silence and my compliance. Dragging his fraud into the open and answering it with forensic evidence completely stripped him of his power. Caleb was in a state of absolute visible panic. Looking at me was no longer an option. Staring at the offshore betting logs in his hands, he suddenly realized that without my credit line to act as a buffer, he was entirely exposed to the shadowy syndicate he owed money to. The reality of his situation had finally breached the walls of his pampered existence. Cecilia looked wildly around the room, searching the faces of the corporate executives for any remaining trace of sympathy. Finding absolutely none, she realized the financial elite do not pity documented fraudsters. Walking calmly back to my table, I took my seat. My CEO, a man known for his ruthless pragmatism, looked at me across the white tablecloth. Embarrassment by the interruption was absent from his demeanor. Instead, he looked profoundly impressed. In the span of 3 minutes, watching me neutralize a massive hostile liability with ice-cold precision and undeniable evidence proved my worth. That was the exact skill set required of a senior partner at his firm. Giving a slight subtle nod to the 2 security guards who were still standing near the entrance prompted them to move forward immediately. Physical force was unnecessary. Miguel, Cecilia, and Caleb were completely deflated. The patriarchal bluster, the maternal guilt, the sibling entitlement, all of it had been crushed by the sheer weight of accountability. The guards simply pointed toward the exit, and my biological family turned around and shuffled out of the ballroom. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, sealing them out of my world permanently. The low murmur of conversation slowly returned to the room, followed by the soft, steady rhythm of the jazz quartet starting back up. The air felt incredibly light. Allowing them to define my identity as a financial conduit for a decade was over. In less than 10 minutes, redefining myself entirely on my own terms was achieved. The ghost was exorcised. Assuming that the public humiliation at the corporate dinner would be the definitive end of the conflict is a logical conclusion, but entitlement is a remarkably stubborn disease. Exactly 1 week later, a thick certified envelope arrived at the reception desk of my office building. Opening it at my desk revealed a formal legal threat drafted by a cheap, aggressive attorney Miguel had somehow managed to hire on contingency. The document was a desperate, grasping attempt at a false counterattack. The lawyer claimed he was preparing to file a civil lawsuit against me for breach of implied verbal contract, arguing that by consistently providing financial support over a 9-year period, I had established a legally binding precedent of care for my dependent parents. The letter demanded an immediate reinstatement of their financial stipends. It also threatened to petition a judge to freeze all of my personal bank accounts until a settlement was reached. A younger version of myself would have panicked, imagining my assets being seized and my life ruined by a prolonged court battle would have been paralyzing. But relying on Lydia's strict guidance meant I was prepared. Hiring a defense attorney or making a frantic phone call to try and negotiate were not on the agenda. Simply opening a new email window, I typed the opposing attorney's address into the recipient line. Attaching exactly 2 PDF files to the email was sufficient. The first attachment was a single-page summary of my irrevocable trust. It proved with absolute legal certainty that Eloise did not own any attachable liquid wealth or investment portfolios. Every major asset was locked inside an impenetrable, independent legal entity. The second attachment was a 50-page ledger of Caleb's structured offshore money laundering transactions, cross-referenced with Miguel's emails instructing him on how to evade federal reporting limits. Typing a single sentence in the body of the email felt satisfying. If you proceed with filing this frivolous civil suit, these attached documents will immediately become part of the public court record, and your clients will instantly face federal structuring and fraud charges. Pressing send, I went to lunch. Less than 24 hours later, a highly formal, incredibly brief email arrived from the attorney, stating that after further review of the facts, he was immediately and permanently withdrawing his representation of Miguel and his family. The final desperate legal threat crumbled into dust before it even reached a courtroom. The defense perimeter was absolutely flawless. The war was truly over. Months passed. The silence that followed the corporate shareholder dinner was not dramatic. It was purely logistical. 30 days after I sent the formal non-renewal notice, the Naperville Property Management Company officially evicted Miguel and Cecilia. Hearing fragments of their new reality through a distant cousin who tried and utterly failed to act as a mediator confirmed the inevitable. They moved into a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in a severely run-down complex on the edge of the city limits. Miguel, a man who once loudly demanded absolute authority and respect, was forced to accept a position sorting inventory at a local discount supermarket just to make the minimum weekly rent. Cecilia's luxurious veneer evaporated instantly. Affording premium salon treatments, imported red wine, or theatrical medical emergencies was no longer possible. When survival becomes a daily mathematical necessity, manufactured anxiety suddenly disappears. Caleb faced a much sharper cliff. With his $80,000 credit line permanently frozen, the offshore gambling syndicate he owed money to lost all their patience. Abandoning his pathetic tech entrepreneur persona, he took a grueling graveyard shift at a regional distribution warehouse, spending every single meager paycheck trying to keep dangerous, impatient debt collectors away from his apartment door became his new reality. They tried to contact me, of course. For the first few weeks, my blocked call log was filled with frantic voicemails and aggressive text messages demanding an immediate reconciliation. Using the heavy word family-wielding guilt and promising they had fundamentally changed were their tactics. But ignoring the voicemails and changing my primary phone number shortly after ensured peace. Pity for their situation was non-existent. Destroying their lives was not my doing. Stepping out of the way and allowing the natural consequences of their own financial incompetence to finally catch up to them was simply justice. In America, the economic system rewards participation, but it brutally punishes persistent denial. Miguel learned that a paycheck from a discount supermarket does not care about his ego. Cecilia learned that surviving requires actual effort, not crying. Caleb learned the exact unforgiving price of his addictions. Math is inherently ruthless. The stunning contrast between their brutal reality and my new life became incredibly clear during the holidays. In late November, the city of Chicago was blanketed in a beautiful, quiet layer of early snow. The air was freezing outside, but inside my new luxury condominium, the atmosphere was perfectly warm. It was Thanksgiving Day. For the past 9 years, Thanksgiving had been a miserable, exhausting ritual of compliance. Usually, spending thousands of dollars catering a massive dinner for Miguel and Cecilia was expected only to sit at the table and endure hours of passive-aggressive commentary about my career, my lifestyle, and my supposed lack of family loyalty. Not this year. This year, the dining table was small, elegant, and entirely peaceful. Sitting across from Tess and my 7-year-old niece Adeline, the rich smell of roasted turkey and fresh baking filled the room. Adeline, now breathing perfectly fine thanks to the premium medical trust I had established, was excitedly showing me her latest report card. Making the highest honor roll at her new, highly rated elementary school was a proud moment. Her tuition was fully covered by the educational fund, safely locked away behind layers of impenetrable legal documentation. Tess raised her glass of wine, her eyes shining with genuine, unprompted gratitude. Tess did not ask me for a sudden loan. Manufacturing a psychological crisis to ruin the meal was not her style. She simply thanked me for giving her daughter a secure, stable future. Smiling and raising my glass to meet hers felt genuine. Tense negotiations, hiding beneath our casual conversation, were absent. The absence of chaos is an incredible luxury. Mentally calculating how to cover someone else's emergency while carving the turkey was no longer necessary. Realizing in that moment that the sentimental American illusion of the biological family is deeply flawed was a revelation. Family is not a mandatory shared bank account dictated by random genetics. Proximity, relying entirely on a financial obligation, is not closeness. It is simply extortion disguised as tradition. True family consists of the people you actively choose to protect, the people who respect your firm boundaries, and the people who celebrate your success without asking for a percentage of it. The apartment felt like home. The ultimate professional validation arrived precisely on schedule. On a crisp Monday morning in early December, walking into the downtown headquarters of my forensic accounting firm felt different. Bypassing the standard cubicle grid and the analyst desks, I walked directly toward the executive corridor. A heavy glass door stood at the end of the hall, overlooking the sprawling, icy expanse of Lake Michigan. Imprinted on the frosted glass in sharp, elegant silver lettering was my name, Eloise, senior partner. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the corner office. The space was immaculate. A massive mahogany desk anchored the room. Urgent, panicked voicemails blinking on the desk phone were a thing of the past. The underlying dread that Miguel or Cecilia would suddenly appear in the lobby to sabotage my hard-earned reputation was gone. Ruthlessly neutralizing the toxic liability in my personal life had preserved my corporate trajectory. Walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window, I placed my hand against the cold glass. Thinking about Lydia brought a smile. The afternoon she locked her office door, handed me the heavy trust documents, and forced me to choose my own survival over toxic biological guilt had changed everything. Lydia had fundamentally understood that high-level success requires defensive architecture. Climbing the corporate ladder while constantly dragging a massive parachute of family debt behind you is impossible. Honoring her brilliant legacy felt right. The irrevocable trust was performing flawlessly, generating compound interest and securing my long-term wealth completely invisible to the people who once viewed my income as their personal safety net. The firm's chief executive officer stopped by my open door later that morning to officially congratulate me on the promotion. Mentioning that my ability to handle complex, high-pressure conflicts with absolute composure was exactly what the executive board valued was validating. He had no idea that my composure was intensely forged in the fire of a 9-year domestic hostage situation. My career was no longer a tool for someone else's extraction. The legacy was finally secure. The entire auditing ordeal fundamentally changed my perspective on loyalty and obligation. Society pushes a very dangerous, romanticized narrative. We are constantly told that adult children must support their parents without limitations, boundaries, or basic accounting. But true adulthood requires the absolute courage of refusal. Refusal is not an insult. Refusal is a legally and morally binding contract of self-respect. When toxic people are allowed to bypass the consequences of their own incompetence, they do not grow. They simply mutate into better manipulators. The transition into complete independence is rarely celebrated by the people you leave behind. Calling you greedy or dramatic is their defense mechanism. Using the heavy language of sacrifice to make you doubt your own sanity is standard practice. But you must always look at the raw data. Looking at the bank statements, the exhausted credit limits, and the years of unreciprocated effort reveals the truth. The numbers will never lie to you, even when your own blood relatives do. Cutting off the endless supply of cash did not mean I abandoned my family. I abandoned the distortion that kept them weak, forcing them to encounter the impartial, unforgiving reality of the American economic market was the only solution. Forcing Caleb to face his illegal debts, Miguel to face his actual limited earning capacity, and Cecilia to navigate a system that does not accept dramatic tears as a valid form of payment was necessary. Love without absolute responsibility is merely a performance. Responsibility without mutual respect is just silent building resentment. The cleanest, healthiest form of affection is creating a distance that protects your hard-earned resources. Respect is the minimum currency of love. If they only value you for what you provide, stepping away isn't betrayal, it's an audit of truth. Owing anyone an endless subsidy just because you share genetic material is a myth. You owe it to yourself to protect the life you worked so relentlessly to build. Thank you for staying through this journey. If you have ever had to enforce strict financial boundaries to save yourself from toxic relatives, drop a true in the comments and share your story. Let's keep building strength together. The final balance was 0.